For most of human history, the simplest act of survival on a battlefield was the oldest one we knew: dig. Scrape the earth with whatever you had: a helmet, a bayonet, your bare hands, and press your body into the wound you made in the ground. In the Second World War, this primal instinct was transformed into a science, an industry, and for millions of soldiers on every front, the single most important skill that separated the living from the dead. The bunkers of World War II were not designed in peacetime offices by men in clean uniforms. They were born in mud, under fire, built by hands that shook with exhaustion and fear, and they changed the shape of modern warfare forever. To understand how those bunkers came to exist, we need to go back one generation. The First World War had delivered a lesson so brutal that no military planner could ignore it. Between 1914 and 1918, the Western Front became a continuous scar across northern France and Belgium. Over 600 kilometers of trenches, dugouts, and fortified positions that swallowed millions of men and produced a stalemate lasting 4 years. The trench systems of the Somme and Verdun were not primitive ditches. By 1917, the German Hindenburg Line featured reinforced concrete shelters buried 6 meters underground, connected by tunnels with electric lighting, ventilation shafts, and sleeping quarters for entire battalions. The lesson was stark. A man standing in the open died. A man behind concrete survived. Artillery could flatten a village in hours, but a properly built bunker could absorb thousands of shells and keep its occupants alive. Every army that fought in that war carried the same conclusion into the next one. The next conflict would be won or lost underground. The interwar years saw this lesson harden into doctrine and concrete, literally. France committed the equivalent of billions of modern dollars to the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications along its eastern border, so elaborate that individual forts contained hospitals, rail systems, retractable artillery turrets, and air-conditioned ammunition magazines buried dozens of meters beneath the surface. Germany responded with the Siegfried Line, known to its builders as the West Wall, a belt of over 18,000 bunkers, gun positions, and tank obstacles stretching from the Dutch border to Switzerland. The Soviet Union fortified its western frontier with the Stalin Line. Even small nations poured concrete. Czechoslovakia built a defensive network so sophisticated that Hitler's generals privately admitted they had no clear plan to breach it by force alone. By 1939, Europe was laced with more fortified concrete than at any point in human history. The age of the bunker had arrived before the first shot was fired. But the opening campaigns of the war shattered a dangerous illusion. The Maginot Line, the most expensive defensive system ever constructed, was rendered irrelevant in 6 weeks. Germany simply went around it, striking through Belgium and the Ardennes forest with a speed that made fixed fortifications seem obsolete overnight. France fell. The lesson appeared to reverse itself. Mobility, not concrete, won wars. Tanks and aircraft could bypass any wall. The bunker, it seemed, was a relic. That conclusion was wrong. What the fall of France actually proved was not that fortifications were useless, but that they could not exist in isolation. A bunker without a mobile reserve behind it was a tomb. A bunker integrated into a flexible defense, supported by artillery and counterattack forces, was something else entirely. This distinction would define the next 5 years of the war. Every army learned it, and every army built accordingly. I think the process began at the most basic level, the individual fighting position. Every soldier in every army was trained to dig. The U.S. Army's Field Manual FM 5-15 dedicated entire chapters to the construction of foxholes, specifying exact dimensions, roughly 1 meter long, 60 centimeters wide, and deep enough to protect a kneeling man from shell fragments. The standard 2-man foxhole took between 30 minutes and 2 hours to complete with an entrenching tool, depending on the soil. In frozen ground along the Eastern Front, Soviet and German soldiers sometimes needed pickaxes and explosives just to break through the first layer of permafrost. The ground itself became an enemy. In the Pacific, Marines hitting coral atolls like Peleliu discovered that their entrenching tools were nearly useless against solid limestone. They resorted to blasting shallow depressions with grenades and piling coral rubble into low walls. Improvised cover measured in centimeters that meant the difference between a grazing wound and a severed artery. The foxhole was only the beginning. When a unit expected to hold a position for more than a few hours, the digging escalated. Communication trenches connected foxholes into a network. Overhead cover appeared. Logs, sandbags, corrugated steel sheets. Anything that could stop a shell fragment or a sniper's bullet from finding its mark. Engineer manuals specified that 18 inches of packed earth could stop a rifle round. 36 inches stopped most shell fragments. But the digging was only half the work. A position that could be seen was a position that could be destroyed. Camouflage became an obsession. On the Eastern Front, German engineers developed standardized concealment techniques that bordered on art. Sod roofs grown with local vegetation, fake tree stumps hollowed out as observation posts, entire bunker complexes disguised as haystacks or ruined farmhouses. Soviet combat manuals dedicated more pages to concealment than to construction itself. The principle was universal across every theater. The strongest bunker in the world was worthless if a spotter in an artillery observation plane could mark it on a map. The best fortifications were the ones nobody knew existed until they opened fire. But stopping a direct hit from a medium-caliber artillery shell required something beyond earth and timber, something the infantry could not carry on their backs. It required concrete. This is where the engineering battalions entered the war. Every major army maintained specialized construction units whose sole purpose was to turn temporary positions into permanent fortifications. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the German Pioneer, the Soviet combat engineers, these men were soldiers who fought with cement mixers and rebar as much as with rifles. A standard German field bunker on the Eastern Front followed a pattern refined through years of brutal experience. First, a rectangular pit was excavated to a depth of roughly 2 meters. Timber frames were erected inside, forming the skeleton of the structure. Steel reinforcing bars were wired together in a grid pattern. Then the concrete was poured, a specific military-grade mix designed for blast resistance, typically using a higher ratio of cement to aggregate than civilian construction. The walls of a standard Regelbau-type bunker were between 1 and 2 meters thick. The roof was even thicker, because the greatest threat came from above. A single bunker of this type consumed between 30 and 50 cubic meters of concrete and required a construction crew of 20 to 40 men working for several weeks. Multiply that by tens of thousands of positions across a front stretching from Norway to North Africa, and the scale becomes staggering. On the Eastern Front, the scale of bunker construction reached its most desperate extremes. At Stalingrad, Soviet defenders turned the ruined city itself into a fortress. Basements of collapsed apartment buildings became machine gun nests. Sewer tunnels served as communication trenches connecting strong points across entire city blocks. Factory workers at the Barricadi and Red October plants fought by day and reinforced their positions by night, pouring improvised concrete from rubble and cement salvaged from destroyed buildings. The Germans, in turn, fortified every meter they captured. A single city block could contain dozens of fortified positions on both sides, separated by distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. The battle produced a grim innovation, the fortified ruin. Soldiers discovered that a partially destroyed building, its walls shattered into irregular shapes, and its floors collapsed into overlapping angles, actually provided better protection than a purpose-built bunker. Shell fragments that would penetrate a flat wall ricocheted harmlessly off angled rubble. Fields of fire that could be predicted and suppressed in a conventional fortification became impossible to map in a landscape where every wall had a different shape. The city taught both armies a lesson they would carry for the rest of the war. Sometimes destruction was its own form of construction. The Atlantic Wall was the most ambitious bunker-building project of the war, and possibly of all time. Not after the Allied raid on Dieppe in 1942 demonstrated that an invasion of occupied Europe was not merely theoretical, Hitler ordered the fortification of the entire coastline from northern Norway to the Spanish border, over 5,000 kilometers. The organization responsible was the Organisation Todt, a quasi-military construction agency that at its peak employed over 1.5 million workers, the vast majority of them forced laborers drawn from occupied countries. all range from simple machine gun nests dug into the ground to massive concrete bunkers and underground tunnels. The fortifications were designed to withstand heavy artillery fire and to provide cover for troops and equipment. The fortifications were built by a large workforce, including soldiers, engineers, and laborers. The fortifications were a major undertaking, and the construction took many years to complete. The fortifications were a key part of the defense of the city, and they played a crucial role in the defense of the city during the war. The fortifications were a lasting legacy of the war, and they continue to be a part of the city's history. The fortifications were a testament to the resilience of the city and its people. The fortifications were a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought for the city. The fortifications were a symbol of the city's strength and determination. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder of the importance of defense in times of war. The fortifications were a reminder ranged from simple machine gun nests dug into cliff sides to enormous casemates housing naval guns capable of firing shells weighing over 800 kilograms. Battery Lindemann, near Calais, mounted 3 guns with a range of 55 kilometers, far enough to shell the English coast. The bunkers protecting these weapons had walls exceeding 3.5 meters of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest naval shells and the largest aerial bombs in the Allied arsenal. The construction consumed more concrete in 2 years than Germany had used for all civilian purposes in the decade before the war. Entire French quarries were requisitioned. Cement trains ran day and night. Yet the most remarkable bunker builders of the war may have been the Japanese. On islands across the Pacific, Japanese garrison forces constructed defensive networks of extraordinary ingenuity using materials that Western engineers would have considered primitive. On Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 20 square kilometers in area, the Japanese garrison of over 20,000 men spent months carving a fortress into the island itself. Mount Suribachi and the surrounding terrain were honeycombed with over 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting bunkers, ammunition stores, hospitals, and command posts. The volcanic rock provided natural insulation against blast and heat. Ventilation shafts were angled to prevent flamethrower fuel from flowing downhill into occupied chambers. Firing ports were cut so narrow that they were nearly invisible from the outside, and yet offered overlapping fields of fire that covered every meter of the landing beaches. On Tarawa, bunkers were built from coconut logs stacked in layers, filled with coral sand and capped with corrugated steel and more sand. A single command bunker on WWII Islet measured roughly 12 meters long and used over 500 coconut logs in its construction, each log between 30 and 40 centimeters in diameter. When the U.S. Navy bombarded the island with over 3,000 tons of shells before the landing, many of these bunkers survived intact. Marines who fought their way across the seawall found themselves facing positions that had absorbed a bombardment equivalent to several hundred kilograms of explosives per square meter, and still functioned. The reason these structures held goes beyond materials. It was engineering adapted to environment with lethal precision. Japanese bunkers were built low, often with no more than 30 centimeters of structure visible above ground level, making them nearly impossible to identify from the air or from a ship offshore. Their interiors were designed so that the blast wave from a near miss would dissipate through angled corridors rather than channeling directly into occupied spaces. Many positions had multiple exits, allowing defenders to abandon a compromised bunker and reoccupy another position connected by tunnel. The philosophy was simple and devastating. Force the attacker to take every position individually, at close range, with infantry. No amount of naval gunfire or aerial bombing could substitute for a man with a flamethrower standing at the entrance. Building these positions was itself a form of warfare. On every front, construction happened under conditions that would paralyze a civilian contractor. Along the Eastern Front, and German and Soviet engineers worked through winters where temperatures dropped below -40 degrees, a point where exposed skin freezes in minutes and steel becomes brittle enough to shatter under impact. Concrete poured in these conditions required chemical additives to prevent it from freezing before it cured, and even then, structures built in extreme cold were often weaker than their specifications demanded. In North Africa, the challenge was reversed. Desert heat accelerated concrete curing so rapidly that batches had to be mixed in small quantities and poured immediately. Sand infiltrated everything: machinery, tools, the mix itself. Water for mixing was sometimes so scarce that engineers rationed it more carefully than drinking supplies. In the Pacific, construction crews worked in tropical heat and humidity that bred malaria, dengue fever, and fungal infections that could incapacitate a man faster than enemy action. On Guadalcanal, the more American construction personnel were evacuated for disease than for combat wounds during the first months of the campaign. The human cost was enormous and often invisible. The organization TOT's workforce building the Atlantic Wall included prisoners of war, political detainees, and civilians conscripted from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond. Working conditions were brutal. 12-hour shifts were standard. Safety equipment was minimal or non-existent. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were replaced, not treated. Exact casualty figures remain disputed, but historians estimate that thousands died during the construction, crushed by falling formwork, buried in tunnel collapses, killed by Allied air raids targeting the construction sites themselves. The bunkers of Normandy were built on a foundation of forced labor, and the concrete that stopped Allied bullets on June 6, 1944, was mixed by men who had no choice in the matter. Inside a finished bunker, life was its own particular form of endurance. The air was perpetually stale, recycled through hand-cranked ventilation systems, or, in larger installations, diesel-powered fans that consumed precious fuel. Condensation dripped from concrete walls and ceilings, keeping everything perpetually damp. Lighting was minimal: kerosene lamps, or, for better-equipped positions, small generators that produced enough electricity for a few bulbs and a radio set. Space was measured in fractions of a meter per man. In the smaller two-man bunkers that dotted the Atlantic Wall, soldiers ate, slept, and waited in a concrete box roughly the size of a large closet. The psychological toll was real and documented. German garrison reports from the Channel Islands describe soldiers suffering from claustrophobia, insomnia, and what medical officers euphemistically termed nervous exhaustion. Soviet soldiers in the fortified positions around Stalingrad lived underground for weeks without seeing daylight, emerging only for counterattacks before retreating back into the earth. On the Japanese-held islands, garrisons sealed inside tunnel complexes endured temperatures that could exceed 50 degrees Celsius in unventilated sections, breathing air so thick with sulfur from volcanic vents that some men wrapped wet cloth around their faces just to keep functioning. The bunker protected. But the bunker also consumed. When the moment came to assault these positions, the cost was measured in bodies. The standard method for reducing a fortified bunker had not fundamentally changed since the First World War. Suppress the firing ports with concentrated fire, approach under cover of smoke, and destroy the position at close range with explosives, flamethrowers, or both. At Normandy, the U.S., Army's assault on Pointe du Hoc required Rangers to scale 30-meter cliffs under fire to reach a battery of casemates that had survived a concentrated naval bombardment. At Iwo Jima, the reduction of a single fortified position could take hours and cost a platoon half its strength. Flamethrower operators, the men most effective against bunkers, had a life expectancy measured in minutes once they were identified by defenders. The portable M2 flamethrower carried by Marines held roughly 7 seconds of fuel, 7 seconds to cross open ground, reach a firing port, and deliver the stream into the interior. The mathematics of that exchange, 7 seconds against a concrete position that had taken weeks to build, captures the fundamental asymmetry of bunker warfare. Later in the war, specialized weapons emerged to tip the balance. The British Tallboy bomb. It is a 5-ton weapon designed by Barnes-Wallis to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, could crack open bunkers that had survived everything else. American engineers developed shaped charges capable of punching through reinforced concrete. But even these tools required men to get close enough to use them, and getting close to a bunker that was still firing remained the deadliest task in any infantryman's war. The war ended, but the bunkers remained. Across Normandy, the casemates of the Atlantic Wall still stand along the beaches, half buried in sand dunes, their concrete darkened by 8 decades of salt air. On Iwo Jima, tunnel entrances are still visible on the slopes of Suribachi. Along the former Eastern Front, the remnants of German and Soviet positions dot the landscape from Finland to the Black Sea. Silent, overgrown, occasionally unearthed by farmers whose plows catch on rebar that has outlasted every person who placed it there. These structures were built to last. The concrete used in the heaviest fortifications has a projected lifespan exceeding 1,000 years. The Cold War that followed ensured the knowledge was not lost. NATO and the Warsaw Pact both studied the bunkers of the Second World War with obsessive detail, extracting lessons that shaped the nuclear shelters, command posts, and hardened missile silos of the next half-century. The logic remained the same: dig deep, pour thick, survive what comes. The men who built them are gone. The wars they fought have passed from memory into history, but the bunkers endure, and they carry in their walls the compressed record of what happens when human ingenuity is turned entirely toward the problem of survival.